Hey there, everyone. My name's Andy Grider, and I am the host and producer of Unique This Week. It's a production of Uniqueness is Power. Invite you to check out the YouTube channel where there's an awful lot of amazing people that we've been fortunate enough to be able to interview, folks that are leaders in their fields that are doing something blue ocean, something new, something cool, all sorts of amazing educational opportunities there. A lot of great tips. Just did a couple more episodes that are going into the production mode. But today we have absolute stellar, timely, step up type of a guest. We've had Paul Cella on before with KeyArcs. We wanted to bring him back because there is something out there right now that is very deserving of at least 19 states worth of attention, which is, getting towards two-fifths of our country. And probably will soon be a lot more than that. Paul is an expert in mitigating expenses and reducing expenses and realigning things for folks in just about any vertical, especially in healthcare, which is, of course, makes him near and dear to our heart with Healthcare Evolution Group. And with his partners, he's able to reduce massive amounts at large hospitals down to significant amounts at practices and groups. And yet, this next piece we're going to talk about might be the most important thing he does. And that's around long-term care. And it's something that America is massively underprepared for. And what the states are doing is indicative of that. We're going to bring Paul in now because we're going to let him talk about this. He's one of the foremost experts in this field. Somebody that I have a ton of respect for and absolutely love getting a chance to talk with. So, Paul, let's talk about, first of all, so everybody understands up front. First of all, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Andy, always a pleasure. Always look forward to doing these talks with you.
We're going to talk, we're going to start simple. Let's talk about what long-term care is. For anybody that doesn't understand how that parses out as far as the companies are concerned or the insurance carriers are concerned, what is long-term care?
So long-term care is not, it's for an individual not being able to perform the basic functions of life. So it starts out with what are called activities of daily living, what you can't perform. Those items, the major six are eating, bathing, dressing, transferring, toileting, continence. Those are the big items. So if you can't perform those items, that makes up the definition of long-term care. And do you need help providing those or doing those services?
And for most policies, it's usually two or three out of the six to qualify. Usually, is that correct?
Good question. It's two out of the six. So they typically, the definition says if you can't perform two of the six activities that I just mentioned, you would qualify if you had a long-term care policy. We'll get into the state, which is three of six, and
Okay.
we'll talk about that.
Well, I was going to say, and then let's talk about the fact you just said if you had a long-term care policy, right? Which is really a big problem because a lot of people don't, and we'll get deeper into that further. But it comes back to that question of how important is long-term care right now in our country, and do people really need to address this? Is this something? I mean, I kind of already know my answer to that because I've seen it from my side of things as well.
Mhm.
But let's talk about why it's important. I think we can agree right up front, Paul, that people do need to address this because the states are either addressing it for them or they're addressing it themselves. But let's talk about how that works.
Yeah, it's Andy, it's a huge problem. I mean, I'm in the business, the financial world, insurance and investments for 30 years. I've very rarely spoke with an individual that hasn't had a personal family experience with long-term care. And it's not a fun topic. It's not something we want, people want to address. People stick their head in the sand with this issue. It's just not a fun topic. But, there's some stats. I don't want to get too stat crazy, but there's over 55 million Americans over age 65. And I think the latest number is only 3% of address long-term care. It's such a big issue that states that you mentioned before are starting to impose taxes on people, working people, because they're scared. Just like Social Security is going bankrupt, Medicaid is going bankrupt, and they're they're rolling out this tax program, which we can talk about in detail, to help curb the issue. So it's a big issue, Andy. I've had both my parents who have passed in the last few years, both needed long-term care in one shape or another. So my initial experiences have been both my parents. And there's people over age 65 now. There is I believe the number is approaching 70%, because people are living longer. Over 70% or approaching 70% will need long-term care. Women will use it more than men because men die sooner, and women that they live longer have more of a need for it. So it's a big issue, Andy, and it's financially it can crush families and crush people. But
Well, I was going to say, because that kind of leads to the next question, Paul. I mean, it's 70%. Let's think about that for just a second. Anybody turning 65 today has about a 70%. That's a 2 out of 3 or higher, really a little higher than 2 out of 3 chance of needing some sort of long-term care. And yet only 3% have anything in place at all. And that's anything at all in place. Those aren't even good policies. Those are just policies. They're not necessarily attuned to what people need. They're just there. Now, long-term care, what does it cost is a big question. And there's a couple different ways you can look at that. You can look at the estimated lifetime costs for somebody. You could look at what it costs for home care. You could talk about assisted living facilities. A lot of different plays in what does long-term care cost. So let's talk about how we arrive at a number that people could sit easier with in having some backing and some protection in what the cost of long-term care is.
Okay, so this is the number. Andy, we have a calculator that I'm happy to forward to people. It's a national calculator, can take your state averages, and it gives you some averages on home health care, assisted facility, nursing home. Anybody that contacts you, I'm happy to send the calculator to. It's a wonderful national calculator. This is an interesting concept, Andy, and I'm trying to put numbers on this so we don't just say, oh, nursing, home health care is about $4,000 a month now. Assisted facilities could be $6,000 a month. A nursing home could be 10 to 9 to 12,000 a month, and the inflation on these is 3 or 4%. But I want to think about this a different way, Andy. I'm looking at it like there's a lot of people with Alzheimer's today, and the typical Alzheimer's care of someone with Alzheimer's with a lifetime care is about $360,000 range. That's about the cost just for Alzheimer care. And I'm citing this example because it hit me the other day, Andy, is that $360,000. Now we're looking at a college tuition, and I'm looking at, geez, this is like college tuition for the elderly. If you think about it, what a crazy concept. Are we planning? We work our lives and we do the right thing. We save the mortgage and put our kids through college and save for college. But are we planning for our parents or our college tuition for the elderly? How crazy is that a concept, Andy? And the costs are just going up. So what I suggest is, whether it's planning for $4,000 a month for home health care minimum, or whether it's an assisted facility at $6,000 or 8 to 10 for nursing home, what I would do is pick a number that is relevant for your family and for your lifestyle. But most importantly, have a plan, Andy. Build it into a plan. And I strongly recommend you build it into a retirement plan, which we can get into deeper. But I would build it into a retirement plan. A lot of people say to me, Paul, I can self-insure this issue. Well, let's look at the numbers. I can educate, or we can educate people on what to expect from your advisor, what to run, and we can get deeper into that in this conversation if you'd like. But I would say having a plan is not just buying an insurance policy, but it's seeing if you could self-insure and if you have enough assets to withstand that claim, that number. And maybe you don't want to, maybe you want to download that risk to an insurance carrier or offload it.
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of times, we'll get to that in a minute, but a lot of times it's easier to do it with protected other people's money In the insurance company case, right? I mean, you don't always, just because you can spend money doesn't mean you should.
You have to,
We'll,
right?
we'll get, we'll get to that in a minute, but let's step back a second because we kind of skated over one of the other things that we want to make sure we talk about a little bit. There is a huge rise just in general need. But you said something earlier that I want to make sure our listeners get a chance to focus in on because this is really important. You mentioned that there are some states that are going to impose a long-term care tax, and it's 19 of them now. Washington State's already done it.
That's the 20th. Yep.
And there's 19 other ones following soon. California's just proposed basically double of what Washington State had proposed. And there's each state is going to finalize as things move along. So obviously you can't spend a lot of time on how that all plays out exactly per state, but let's talk about that lifetime benefit versus what you were just talking about. So you were talking about 4,000 a month in the minimum case scenario.
In home health care, minimum.
Right. So let's just say 4,000 times 12. I'm not a math guy, but that's 48,000. I can do that, right? And let's say you need a year and a half of long-term care at home. So you're going to add another 24 to that. So that's 72,000. Now let's talk about what the lifetime pool of benefit is in most states.
And so most states, and again, Andy, as I said, this is going to be fluid right now. And I believe nothing's happening until after the election because this is it's a time bomb. I mean, it's just not a fun issue, but it's going to be addressed, just like Social Security will be addressed shortly. But what the states are proposing in general is a 36,500 total lifetime pool of benefit. And with that, they're requiring 3 of the 6 ADLs that I mentioned before, the activities of daily living versus an individual policy, 2 of 6 ADLs. So Washington State imposed a 0.58% payroll tax per $100. As you mentioned, California is proposing, the last I understood this, 1.2% tax. So states are either going to do a payroll tax or an income tax, state income tax on the monies, and it's going to be all over the boards. But that's just the starting point of where this is going to go down. So why address it is if the state's going to give you something that's not enough, that 36,500, they're giving you 3 of 6 ADLs. That's not a good thing. That's a harder bar to cross. What I suggest is the urgency is take a look at this now for you and your family. Address this issue with your advisor or your trusted advisor. Address this issue now so that what can you do on your own for that same amount of potential tax? What could you do on your own and potentially get grandfathered out of the state situation for an inferior program?
There's the key. By acting now, you're being proactive and not being roped into the state tax. If you don't act now, there's a decent chance you're going to have to pay the state tax and probably add some sort of ancillary or extra care to it because 36,500 isn't going to be, even if they doubled that, Paul, even if they doubled that amount, it's not anywhere near enough. And no, they're not going to double it. We also know that the reason they're doing it, again, is because of the rising number of claims, the amount of people that are going to end up indigent or out on their own or in bad positions. Because the other thing we've seen is whether you end up in long-term care in a skilled nursing facility, whether you end up in assisted living, whether you end up with home care, more and more Americans are ending up in the home care and the assisted living facilities because they simply can't afford the SNFs, the skilled nursing facilities, and the higher end long-term care, memory care facilities, things like that. And so putting something in place that allows you to have that ability to choose and a plan that's flexible enough is really key. So let's talk about how do you handle planning for this? You mentioned earlier tying it to retirement. You mentioned before having something that works in conjunction with your financial advisor. But having a plan is the most important thing. And there was another part about making sure that you have everybody involved so everybody understands in the family what the hell's going on.
Yeah, you hit it, Andy. I was just going to say that the most important thing is round up the family. I mean, I mentioned before, we did put it, my brothers and I put together a plan for my parents, and we got together and, you know, who's going to take care of mom and dad? Where are they going to stay? And for how long? What's the tipping point where we would go to a nursing facility? And no one wants to send their parents to a nursing facility, but what's the tipping point? So having that family meeting with the way things would roll down, putting it on paper, that to me is as important as how you're going to fund it, is having the plan. And so step one is get the family together, and then the family makes some big, broad decisions on how they would want things to roll, and then bring in the advisors, whether it's your trusted advisor, attorneys, elderly attorney, or whatever you may have. And then I go back to that retirement plan, Andy, because to me it's the core to everything. So the family gives the dream of what they would want, how they would want this to roll, and then the retirement plan takes their assets, the parents' assets or your assets, and then you have a couple of different plans. An as-is plan. Have your retirement number. I need X amount in retirement, whether it's Social Security, rental income, IRA, 401ks, whatever assets you have, tax adjusted everything. And then the bottom line is, do you have your monthly number in retirement? That's plan one. Plan two is throw in a fictitious claim at 82 when these things typically happen, and throw in a long-term care claim or an assisted living or a nursing home claim of $8,000 or $9,000 a month. And then how would those assets look at that point? And then the last scenario is if you're able to move some assets around a little bit and download the risk or offload the risk to an insurance carrier. Do you want to know the exposure? Can you handle it? And then self-insure or not? Or do you want to offload the risk? And that to me, that three-phase process is what you should get from an advisor, so you can see the bigger picture, and then you can understand the numbers. Hey, this makes sense. And typically insurance is pennies on the dollar as far as cost.
Well, depending on your age and depending on other things and when you start planning. So, I mean, again, this is something that's also really important. A lot of people aren't going to think about it as part of their retirement plan.
Mm-hmm.
In their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even into their 60s, they're not thinking about it that way. The states are starting to force hands on thinking about it, or otherwise we're going to put you into a tax that you don't necessarily want to pay, that isn't going to really truly benefit you in the end, but it's going to help take care of various other folks along the way. There are a lot of different possibilities on types of products, Paul, and we want to make sure we get through these a little bit to kind of give our listeners a chance to digest what types of plans. There's traditional, there's hybrid, there's things that have annuities that you can leverage. There's other pieces like that. Let's talk a little bit about what's there, whether that's qualified money, non-qualified money, how that all works. Give our listeners a little bit of an education there, and then we'll circle back on the last couple things, but we want to make sure we get to these before we get to the end of the episode.
That's great. I think, Andy, what I would offer is, I'll get into the types in a moment, but I would offer getting with somebody who knows long-term care. There's a number of types, as you just alluded to. There's traditional long-term care insurance, which has been around about 25 years, which is still an infancy stage for insurance policies. But traditional insurance, where it only pays for long-term care, and that's traditional. So if you have an event like long-term care, it will pay. Traditional policies today are typically what are called reimbursement policies, meaning you file a claim and then you get reimbursed for that money. And it's a bit of a pain in the tail. We had a reimbursement on my parents. I wish we had the second type, an indemnity, where indemnity is if you qualify as the 2 of 6 ADLs, you just get paid the cash, and you can use that cash to go buy a car with it. Once you qualify, you qualify. So there's traditional. There are life policies now, which is really interesting, Andy. Life policies with what are called living benefits. So if you have $1 million death benefit policy, mom or dad, or me or you, whoever we're talking to, you have $1 million policy. The old type of policy, you have to pass, you have to die for someone to benefit from it. The new policies, if I have $1 million policy, I can tap into that $1 million. And if I need $600,000 of long-term care, I can get those dollars. I call them dollar for dollar dollars. There's no inflation, there's no deflation on it, or market risk. I've got $1 million pool there. So if I use $600,000 of care, I could pay for my care while I'm alive, and then the remaining 400 would go to my heirs. That's insurance with living benefits. So if you have an old type of policy, you may want to take a look at your policy and see what's out there as far as living benefits. And then the last type is what's called an annuity policy. And annuities have, if you are uninsurable, meaning you can't get a life policy, there are annuities out there that if you put in $100,000, they give you leverage towards more long-term care, meaning 100,000 might get you 300,000 of benefit for long-term care. It's a multiplier effect.
Right.
So whether you're insurable or non-insurable, there's options out there for people. So those are the main types. And then there's what I call a hybrid situation where people use annuities of IRA money, maybe $200,000, and they take that, maybe some of that money, and pay it into a life policy and have a fixed payment, Andy, to coordinate those things together. But in the end, I would definitely work with a long-term care professional to navigate these items with a retirement plan.
And the other part to this is, I think it's really important for people to understand, they want to make sure that they build this in to and around their retirement plan, and they want to do it soon. And we want to come back to why on both. Why do they want to build it into the retirement plan? And then secondly, why do you want to act now? Because that's the other big key that we have right now that is probably the biggest issue, I think, facing people is if they're not proactive, they're going to get roped into these state taxes in a lot of cases. And employers want to know about this because they don't want their employees being upset because suddenly an extra 1% of their paycheck is gone, or a 0.5% or whatever else it happens to turn out to. I mean, California is probably, by just history, probably going to be the most egregious at 1.2% proposals, but there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be around 1%, because as soon as somebody does 1.2, 1% becomes acceptable. So let's talk about let's talk about where the where this ties in. Again, why is it important now, and then why is it important to tie it to the retirement plan?
So important now because of the legislation that is on the books, and again, I said this will not happen until after the election. So the urgency becomes, if you do something about it now, you could potentially get grandfathered out. Washington State, for people that had long-term care in place, got grandfathered out of that 0.58% tax. So that's the urgency of now. As a benefit for a family, you can, why now? Well, this needs to be addressed. People keep pushing, kicking the can down the road. But the urgency of the legislation, to me, is a good thing. Address the issue. And then the second part about the retirement plan, I just can't stress enough that the retirement plan allows you to understand the need, understand not only the need, but understand how to deal with the need, and how much you can. I go back to the self-insure versus download, Andy. The plan gives you financial wherewithal, where as a family you could sit down and say, hey, mom, dad, what makes the most sense? Or you could talk to your brothers and sisters, what makes the most sense for mom and dad, or for your situation, or for my situation.
Right. And again, the other thing I think that was key to this is the idea that you want to start planning early. This isn't something to ignore until you're 60. This isn't something to deal with when you're 70. Despite the fact you mentioned earlier, most claims happen in your mid to late 70s, early 80s average. You don't want to wait until the end, because whether you're doing an annuity with leverage or other things where you might not qualify otherwise, you're still not getting as much leverage by any means the older you get, because you lose 1% per year after 55, if I remember correctly from what I read. And so, I mean, if you're in that world, you just want to make sure you're prepared. So again, coming back, you mentioned long-term care professionals, somebody who's a financial advisor that you trust, and an estate, elderly estate planning, somebody that helps attorney-wise that way. You put together a package of folks, because no one person's going to know all of it. Paul, what can someone come to you for, and how do they get hold of you? What's the best way to do that?
I mean, someone could send an email to me, Paul at KeyArcs, KeyArx.com. And if they would want a one-on-one meeting, we would be happy to schedule with any of your listeners, Andy, as we have in the past with other issues. But I would encourage scheduling a one-on-one meeting just to get the landscape, and then you can give we could talk about a fact pattern with you and your personal situation, and I can help someone map out a good game plan for them and their family. So that's really the best way to do it. Happy to give the calculator, as I mentioned earlier, that national calculator for costs. So anybody that wants to respond to your podcast, just say calculator, I'd like to do a one-on-one meeting. And Andy, there's no charge. I will not charge any of your listeners any fees or anything like that for a consultation.
And these could be individual people, Paul, or they could be company executives who want you to present to a company. So everybody gets this. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, individually is one thing, but you hit it on the head there. We do group webinars, and I do seminars or webinars that I have the owner or the HR can tape the webinars and they distribute it to the population. I go back to that legislation, Andy. It's happening. So the urgency is take advantage of pre-legislation going down, do something now, or at least understand the possibilities of what could be done now, as opposed to after the thought. Most people will be kicking themselves if you knew what I knew now, you'd want to address it now.
Exactly. And that's really the key. So again, it's Paul at keyarcs.com. That'll be up on the screen during our piece here. And the calculator is going to be really helpful. The one other thing that, Paul, we probably want to put up on the screen at some point is the list of the states. So if you can get over the list of the states that are considering.
Absolutely. I'll send that over to you. Absolutely. So you can put it up.
But again, we've got an ability here, folks. And I want to just stress this to everyone before we sign out, is that Paul has addressed a major issue for not just individuals, but employers and their employees. And it's something that's coming in at least 19 states, 20 states, somewhere in there. That's 2 out of every 5 states, right? If you aren't already in the crosshairs there, you're going to end up in it as things move forward in most states. You will see this in well over half, if not 4/5 of the states eventually, is what the projections are. If you listen to the lobbyists, you talk to the industry leaders, that's what they're telling everybody, is this is coming. And it's an attempt to alleviate the state from having to deal with the taxes and the costs and the play out. But it's not going to be enough to support your needs as an individual in 99.7% of the cases. You might get really lucky, but the general gist is that most people, when they need long-term care, are going to need it for anywhere between 18 and 24 months. And realistically, most people that need it in a bigger way than what the state could possibly address over that time period. So unless you have other means that you're banking on, and even then I double check them based on Paul's advice, make sure you really truly understand what a hit from a long-term care incident could, what that could do to the ripple effect on your overall portfolio, what you plan to leave for the kids, what you plan to do as legacy. All of those things matter. Paul's an expert at that. He's also somebody that can talk to you about your ancillary and your major medical group benefits. So as a company leader, you can make really good time with a conversation with Paul. Highly recommend reaching out to him. He's one of the most credible people that I've ever met when it comes to insurance. He's also a fantastic partner in a lot of what we do in healthcare. He's been helping out a lot of folks that we know and really garnering some amazing traction in the industry in a way that fixes a broken model. And again, this is another way to fix a broken model. One of the reasons we love having people like Paul on Unique this week, because they are in a sort of blue ocean where it was red. There's been problems around long-term care. There's been problems around ancillary and major medical group benefits all around all of that. Paul's managed to come up with solves for everyone. And that don't even, in the other 2 cases, don't even upset HR. So reach out to him. Take the time. Listen to the other episode we did with him. There's so much good here under one roof for each of you as a business owner, as an employee, as an individual, as a family member. So take the time, listen in. Thanks again for being here, and appreciate you, Paul.
Thanks, Andy. You're the best. Take care.
Talk soon. Thanks.